Don't look at the history books yet. Look at Google Maps. If you open the satellite view of the Chelyabinsk region in Russia, right in the middle of the Ural Mountains, and zoom in, you will see something that shouldn't be there. It looks like a scar, a long, jagged tear, running across the landscape for 300 kilometers. It's a dead zone, no villages, no farms, just forests, swamps, and a deafening, geometrical emptiness. From space, it looks like a giant beast, clawed at the earth. Scientists call it the EURT, the East Urals radioactive trace. It covers 23,000 square kilometers. That is the size of entire European countries. And here is the paradox. You know the word Chernobyl. You know Fukushima. You might even know 3 Mile Island. But the event that created this scar for 30 years, it didn't exist. It wasn't in the newspapers. It wasn't in the history books. If you asked the Soviet government, they would tell you that the sky over the Urals was blue, the grass was green, and the atom was peaceful. But the atom wasn't peaceful. You think Chernobyl was the original sin of nuclear energy. You are wrong. Chernobyl was an accident, a horrific, incompetent accident. But what happened here in 1957 was not an accident. It was a crime stretched out over a decade, methodically planned and executed. This is the story of how a superpower decided that burning its own people was an acceptable price for a bomb. To understand the scale of this lie, you have to imagine a city that technically didn't exist. The year is 1948. The Soviet Union is starving. The war has left the country in ruins. People are eating potato peels. But deep in the Urals, hidden behind barbed wire and checkpoints, there is a utopia. In this city, the shops are bursting with caviar, chocolate, and high-quality sausages. The apartments are free. The salaries are 5 times higher than the national average. It sounds like paradise, doesn't it? But there is a catch. This city has no name. It is not on any map. It has no address. If you live here, you don't exist. You cannot tell your mother, your brother, or your children where you are. Your passport stays at the gate. If you leave, you never come back. They called it Chelyabinsk-40. Today, we know it as Ozyorsk. This was the heart of the Soviet nuclear beast. This is where they built the Combine number 817, the Mayak plant. Its purpose was simple: create plutonium for the atomic bomb, create the shield of the motherland. And they did. They built the shield. But in the process, they dug a grave so deep that we are still trying to climb out of it. 70 years later, fast forward to a Sunday evening, October 1957, villagers in the surrounding settlements step out onto their porches. They look up and they freeze. The sky is glowing. It's a deep, pulsating crimson red. It's beautiful. It looks like the northern lights have descended to the Urals. The next day, the local newspaper, the Chelyabinsk Worker, runs a charming little article. I'm quoting them now. Dear comrades, last night, many of you observed a rare natural phenomenon, an intense polar aurora. This testifies to the intense activity of the sun. It was a beautiful lie, romantic even, but there is a problem. Polar auroras happen in the ionosphere. 100 kilometers up, they don't smell like ozone. They don't cover your car in gray dust. And most importantly, polar auroras don't make you vomit blood 2 hours after you look at them. That wasn't the sun acting up. That was the reflection of a nuclear fire, burning so hot it turned the night sky into a warning signal. So, what actually happened that night? In this video, we're going to walk through the timeline of a catastrophe that stayed classified for 3 decades. We will look at the engineering arrogance that led to an explosion equivalent to 70 tons of TNT. We'll uncover how the Soviet Union used an entire population as biological test subjects, diagnosing them with fake diseases to study the effects of radiation without treating them. And we will answer the most disturbing question of all. Why did the CIA know about this almost immediately? And why did they choose to help the Soviets keep it a secret? Buckle up. We are going into the zone. To understand why the sky turned red in 1957, we have to go back 12 years. August 1945, the United States drops Little Boy on Hiroshima. The city is erased. Stalin is terrified. He realizes that without a bomb, the USSR is defenseless. He calls his most ruthless manager, Lavrenti Beria, and gives him a simple order: build me a bomb. I don't care what it costs. I don't care how you do it. Just do it. The key phrase here is, I don't care what it costs. They start building Mayak. They use 40,000 prisoners. They use soldiers. They work in blizzards with bare hands. Speed is the only metric that matters. Safety isn't even a secondary concern, it's an obstacle. By June 1948, they launched the first industrial reactor, the A1. It's a triumph. They are making plutonium. The Kremlin is happy. Beria is happy. But in the rush to build the reactor, the engineers forgot one tiny detail, one insignificant detail. When you make plutonium, you generate a massive amount of liquid nuclear waste, highly radioactive acid. So they paused and asked a question: where do we put this poison? In the United States, at Hanford, they were building expensive tanks, double-shelled underground tanks, to store this waste. The Soviets looked at the budget, then they looked at the map, and they saw the Ticha River. It was a slow, beautiful river. It wound through dozens of villages. The engineers thought, well, water flows, right. Dilution is the solution to pollution, so, starting in 1949, they did the unthinkable. They turned a valve. For 3 years, Mayak dumped 76 million cubic meters of high-level radioactive waste downstream in the village of Metlino. People lived their lives, they drank this water, they watered their cattle. Women rinsed their laundry at the riverbank, kids swam in it. The concentration of radiation in the Teka River became so high that if you stood on the bank, it was like standing inside a functioning X-ray machine that someone had taped into the on position. They didn't just pollute a river, they turned a natural water source into a flowing nuclear reactor. By 1951, even the Soviet leadership realized that turning a major river system into a radioactive sewer was a bad idea, not because people were dying, that was acceptable, but because the radiation was showing up in the Arctic Ocean. It was becoming too obvious. So they stopped the direct dumping. They needed a new solution. They decided to build, quote, imagine a giant concrete canyon, buried 8 meters underground. Inside this canyon, they placed massive stainless steel tanks. Each tank held 300 cubic meters of the most vile, toxic sludge known to man, acetate and nitrate waste. From the plutonium separation process, here is the chemistry you need to know. This waste is alive. It is highly radioactive, which means it generates its own heat. It's always boiling. It's like a pot of thick jam on a stove. If you don't stir it, and if you don't cool it, it gets hot. If it gets too hot, the water evaporates. And when the water is gone, you are left with quote, _5, acetate and nitrate salts. Do you know what else is made of nitrates? Gunpowder, essentially. They stored thousands of tons of wet gunpowder underground, relying on a cooling system to keep it from drying out and detonating. What could possibly go wrong? September 29th, 1957, Complex S3, tank number 14, inside this steel belly. Something was wrong, but nobody knew it. The cooling system for tank 14 had failed. We don't know exactly when, maybe a day ago, maybe a week. The sensors, they had corroded and failed months ago. The maintenance logs, faked. The repair crews, they didn't want to go down there because the radiation levels were lethal. So tank 14 was left alone. In the dark, the radioactive sludge began to heat up. 100 degrees Celsius, the water boils off. 200 degrees, the sludge turns into a dry, crusty cake of nitrate salts. 300 degrees. Inside that tank, 70 tons of radioactive material, transformed into 70 tons of high-grade explosive. It was a bomb, waiting for a single spark, an electrical short, a friction spark, anything. At 4 p.m., the shift supervisor checked the logs. Everything looked normal because nobody was looking at the reality. Shiliu, 22. Boom! The force of the explosion is estimated between 70 and 100 tons of TNT. Let's put that in perspective. Tank 14 was covered by a concrete lid. That lid weighed 160 tons. That is the weight of 3 heavy battle tanks. The explosion tossed that 160-ton lid 25 meters into the air. Like a coin, it ripped the roof off the storage facility. It shattered windows in barracks kilometers away. And then the plume rose, 20 million curies of radioactivity, shot 1 kilometer into the atmosphere. Now, you might say, Chernobyl released 50 million curies. This was less, that is technically true, but here is the difference. Chernobyl was a reactor fire. The isotopes were lighter. At Mayak, 90% of the fallout was heavy. It crashed down immediately, right on the industrial site. But the remaining 2 million curies, the wind caught them, a steady, helpful breeze, blowing towards the northeast. It picked up the strontium and the cesium and carried them over the forests, over the lakes, and over the sleeping villages of the Chelyabinsk region. The first people to see the horror were the guards, soldiers of the internal troops. They saw the explosion. They saw the gray dust settling on their boots, on their uniforms. What were their orders? Guard the breach. They stood there, no hazmat suits, no respirators, just cotton uniforms and rifles. They were guarding a hole in the ground that was emitting lethal radiation, breathing in plutonium dust. Then came the underscore, quote, underscore 6 underscore. This is the part that truly breaks your heart. The management of Mayak needed to clean up the site, but they didn't want to panic the population. So what did they do? They sent school children to the fields. They told the local schools to send kids to harvest potatoes in the nearby fields. The kids noticed the potatoes were strange. Some were covered in gray ash. Some were deformed. But the order was harvest. Pregnant women were sent to wash the clothes of the soldiers. They scrubbed the radioactive uniforms with their bare hands. Nobody said a word about radiation. At Chernobyl, as delayed as it was, the word radiation was eventually spoken. Here, silence was the doctrine. The people breathing that dust believed they were safe. They were just doing their duty. 10 days, it took 10 days, before the evacuation squads arrived. At the nearest villages, Berdianish, Saltikovo, Galakaivo. Imagine you are a peasant, living in the house your great-grandfather built. Suddenly, men in strange rubber suits and gas masks kick down your door. They don't explain anything. They give orders. Get out. Now. What about my cow? Bang. They shoot the cow in the yard. What about my clothes? Burn them. They dug huge trenches and buried the livestock. They torched the houses. They dragged screaming families onto trucks. Over 10,000 people were uprooted. They were given a compensation of about 2 rubles per person and dumped in empty fields. Kilometers away, no explanation, no medical advice, just a signature on a piece of paper. That said, I promise not to disclose state secrets. They didn't know what the secret was. They just knew their lives were over. They had become ghosts of the Soviet machine. Now, here is the twist. You expect the Soviet Union to lie. That's what totalitarian regimes do. They protect the image of the state, but surely the West, the enemies of the USSR, the champions of truth, surely they would expose this. The CIA knew. By 1958, barely a year later, CIA analysts were looking at photos. From U-2 spy planes, they saw the destroyed buildings. They saw the scorched earth. They saw the new, strange patterns of exclusion zones. They knew a catastrophic nuclear event had occurred, but the United States government said nothing. Why? Because of the glasshouse theory. In the late 50s, the U.S. nuclear program was fragile. They were building their own reactors. They were testing their own weapons. Public opinion was starting to get nervous about radiation if the world found out. That nuclear waste could simply explode and wipe out a region the size of Rhode Island. The panic would be global. It would threaten the U.S. nuclear industry just as much as the Soviet one. So a silent handshake took place. Across the Iron Curtain, the Cold War enemies agreed on one thing. The atom must remain prestigious. The dead Russian peasants were collateral damage in a PR war for nuclear energy. Back in the Urals, the cover-up became medical. The hospitals in Chelyabinsk began filling up. People came in with strange symptoms. Their hair was falling out. Their skin was covered in ulcers. Their white blood cell counts were zero. The doctors knew exactly what it was. Acute radiation syndrome. But they had orders, a secret decree from Moscow, forbade the diagnosis of radiation sickness. So they invented a new reality. They wrote in the charts neuralgia, special grip, and the most cynical of all, vegetative vascular dystonia of the second degree. They created a special closed institute, FIB-4, but this wasn't a hospital. It was a laboratory. The doctors at FIB-4 examined the patients. They took blood samples. They measured the decay of their bodies. They recorded the data meticulously, and then they sent them home. They didn't treat them. They studied them. The population of the Urals became the largest control group. In the history of radiobiology, the Soviets needed to know how radiation kills people over the long term for a potential nuclear war. And here, they had thousands of free test subjects. The world continued to spin, ignorant of the scar, until 1976. A Soviet dissident scientist named Zhoris Medvedev, exiled in London, published a short article in the New Scientist. He wrote about a nuclear disaster in the Urals. He described the explosion, the evacuation, the hundreds of square miles of wasteland, the reaction from the Western scientific community. Laughter. Sir John Hill, the chairman of the UK Atomic Energy Authority, publicly called Medvedev's story rubbish. Nuclear waste doesn't explode, they said. This is just science fiction. It took 10 more years. It took the catastrophe of Chernobyl in 1986 for the Soviet Union to finally admit that maybe, just maybe, something had happened in 1957, only in 1989. 32 years later, were the documents declassified? The people of the Urals finally learned why they were dying. But history isn't just about the past. It's about the present. Let's go back to the river, the Techa River. While they evacuated the villages directly under the explosion plume, they forgot, or chose to ignore, the villages on the river. There is a village called Musliumovo. It stands on the banks of the Techa. For decades, the children of Musliumovo played on the riverbanks. They fished in the radioactive water. They weren't resettled in 1957. They weren't resettled in 1986, only in the mid-2000s. Did a program finally start to move them? A few kilometers away. I want you to understand this. While you were watching cartoons in the 90s, while you were buying your first iPhone, people in Musliumovo were dying of cancer at rates that defy statistics. They call it the river disease, genetic defects, leukemia, chronic fatigue. It's not a horror movie. It's a village where the graveyard is the busiest place in town. And it was preventable. We love stories of greatness. We love to look at the rockets, at the icebreakers, at the massive dams. The Soviet Union projected an image of invincible power. We were the first in space. We tamed the atom. But greatness is rarely free. It is bought on credit. And the interest rates on Soviet greatness were paid in human lives. The Kishtim disaster is the ultimate proof of what happens when the goal becomes more important than the human, when secrecy becomes a religion, safety becomes a heresy. They sacrificed a region to build a bomb they never used. They poisoned a river to save a budget sheet. They lied to the world to save face. Today, if you go to the East Urals, you will find the EURT State Reserve. It sounds like a national park, and in a way, it is. The nature there is breathtaking. The birch trees are tall, the grass is lush, animals roam freely, elk, boars, wolves. It's beautiful because we aren't there. Humans cannot live there. For another few hundred years, the radiation has sunk into the soil, into the roots of the trees. The scar has healed over with green leaves, but underneath, the poison remains. This place is a monument, not to science, but to arrogance. We say never again. After every disaster, after Kishtim, after Chernobyl, after Fukushima. But history teaches us only one thing, that it teaches us nothing. The scar on the Urals is still there, visible from space, staring up at us like an unblinking eye, waiting for us to make the mistake again. Let's hope, this time, we are looking